we end the death study on the most horrendous chapter of the whole dark story by talking about the Holocaust and the final solution. Now, as you know, and probably can estimate, that there was a sense that persecution of the Jews had been ever increasing since Hitler took to power. Now, the war changes the circumstance of that dramatically. In fact, the persecution of the Jews will develop in intensity after the outbreak of war. When the Nazis defeat Poland in 1939, they set about Germanizing Western Poland. This means transporting Poles from their homes and kicking them out of their homes and replacing them with German settlers. And as a consequence of the Second World War, for every 5 Poles alive in 1939, 1 of them would be dead, either Jewish or non-Jewish, as a result of fighting or the racial policies enacted by the Nazis between 1939 and 1945. The Jews who were found in Poland, and there were several million of them, were rounded up and transported to the major cities, where they were herded into sealed areas called ghettos. The 2 most notorious ghettos set up in Poland were in the capital city of Warsaw, and the other one is Lodz, spelled L-O-D-Z. The able-bodied Jews were used from this point on as slave labor. The young, old, and the sick, and those who had simply been worked down, were left to die from hunger and disease. And very soon these ghettos turned into places of untold horrors, mass death, starvation, typhoid breaks out, and they really are death by means of confinement. As the Nazis progressed in the war and they moved into the Soviet Union, they framed the struggle as one of annihilation, as one of the dominance of the Aryan races over the Bolsheviks. And as a consequence, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union will also change the dynamic in regards to the persecution of the Jews. They find themselves in control now of 3 million Russian Jews as they advance towards the gates of Moscow. The Nazis actually almost get to Moscow. They come to about 40 kilometers away in 1941, but are eventually halted at that particular time. The German army operating in the east is given orders to round up and shoot Communist Party officials and their Jewish supporters. And the shootings were given to a division of the SS known as the Einsatzgruppen. And there were 4 Einsatzgruppen divisions sent to pacify different regions of the occupied territories in the east. By autumn 1941, most of these Einsatzgruppen are involved in mass shootings, loosely interpreting their orders to shoot communists and communist Jews. They interpret it to shoot all Jews. They oftentimes encourage the local populations to seek retribution on the Jewish populations. In Latvia, for instance, the local population massacres the Jews without the Germans even lifting a finger. However, by 1941, the mass shootings are taking place all over Germany and the occupied East, all over the German-occupied East. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are being murdered, oftentimes in the most brutal ways, at really close contact, as much as putting a gun to somebody's head and shooting them, men, women, children, babies, you name it. And in Germany, at this particular point, all Jews are now further persecuted by being made to wear the yellow Star of David to mark them out. With the Holocaust, if you will, already in full swing, it's important to really make this distinction. Before the death camps are ever made, the Holocaust is already occurring. Approximately, probably actually close to 1 million Jews have already been murdered in the occupied East. But in late January 1942, senior Nazi officials, no one very senior, but senior Nazi officials meet at Wannsee, which is a suburb of Berlin, to formalize the process of mass murder. They called this process the final solution to the Jewish question. And at Wannsee, it becomes very clear that the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, will be put in charge of the systematic killing of all Jews within the occupied territories. Following Wannsee, in something known as Operation Reinhardt, death camps are soon established at Helmo, Treblinka, and Sobibor, and eventually in 1943 at Auschwitz. The young, sick, and the old, it was understood, were to be killed immediately. The able-bodied, again, were first to be used as slave labor until they could no longer be used, and then they were to be killed. Some of the people who found themselves in these terrible places were used for appalling medical experiments. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the most notorious of them all, did horrendous experiments on twins. By the end of the war, by April 1945, 6 million Jews, 500,000 European gypsies, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and Russians had been sent to these camps to be worked, gassed, or shot The total cost of the Holocaust overall is around 6.5 million. The Jewish population, or the Jewish contingent of those murdered, numbered nearing 6. It's oftentimes important to stop and look at the degree of resistance there was to the Holocaust, because we tend to think that the Holocaust was essentially just the murdering of Jews, but we need to know that the Jews did fight back. Many Jews escaped from Germany before the war had started. Others managed to live under cover in Germany, hiding their identity, and they lived undercover in the occupied territories as well, in France, the Netherlands, Poland, Russia, you name it. For example, a man named Gad Beck led a Jewish resistance in the city of Berlin, and he was able to fight back against the Nazis until April 1945, when he was captured by the Nazis and about to be executed. In fact, the Russians learn that he is about to be executed, and a Jewish detachment of the Soviet army, basically a commando unit, breaks into Berlin and captures him and saves his life. There were 28 known groups of Jewish fighters fighting against the Germans all over the East. Many of the Jews fought in resistance movements in occupied lands, working for the French resistance or the Belgian resistance, you name it. In 1945, another famous example of resistance is when the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto rose up against the Germans and held out for 4 weeks before they were finally crushed, and 40,000 of them were killed by the German forces. In the concentration camps, of which there were many across Germany, 5 of them saw uprisings. In Sobibor, there was a famous escape of thousands of Jews, many of whom were rounded up and quickly and promptly murdered. However, some did escape and lived to see the end of the war. The Jews managed to blow up one of the gas chambers or gas ovens at Auschwitz in a form of retaliation. The Jews did not take their fate passively, and that's an important thing to consider. Additionally, a lot of Germans did help. Many Germans and non-Jews helped the Jews by hiding them and smuggling them out of German-held territory. Famous examples include Oskar Schindler, who protected and saved many by getting them on his list of workers. Very famously, the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who was in Hungary at the time, worked with other resistors to provide Jews with Swedish and U.S. passports and get them smuggled out of Hungary before the Nazis could turn on the Hungarian Jews and ship them to places like Auschwitz. Unfortunately, and probably not surprisingly, the high-profile cases like Schindler and Wallenberg are quite rare. There were resistors, most of whom we know nothing about, that you need to remember, who were successful because they kept a low profile. They weren't discovered by the Nazis, nor were they discovered by historians today. Why? Because in order to resist, you had to be unknown, because the consequences of being unknown were almost certain death. Therefore, there was resistance. That concludes the depth study. I hope you enjoyed our brief, although, relatively thorough coverage of the events that led to Hitler's coming to power, Hitler's time in power, the Second World War, and the destruction of Nazi Germany. We'll be moving on to the Cold War after this, so we get to learn sort of what happens as a consequence of the Second World War and follow the story of modern European history all the way up till 1991.